Build 1469. Build 1469 was made to show off the new DirectX 9 render. Accordingly, the build possesses 3 test locations set in the cordon. Unfortunately, I cannot show you this build, as apparently from what I can gather, when they were copying this build to upload it online, very important resources responsible for the correct operation of the graphic component of the build was lost, leaving us with a build that most of the time refuses to launch, and when it does launch, it's just a black screen because there's no graphics. Unless you have an ATI Radeon 9600 XT graphics card. If you do have one, then the build actually launches, allowing you exploration. Obviously, I don't have this graphics card, so I can't show the build to you. Trust me, I tried everything I could do to get it working, but unfortunately nothing did. So the most I can show you were the few pictures I managed to track down. This is regrettably not the only build that I could not get to work in this episode, but I'll get to that later. Build 1472-1. Build 1472. Now this one is a big one. It contains the original versions of the CNPP back when it was one single level. Yes, you heard that right. The entire Chernobyl power plant used to be one humongous level. It is also the very first appearance of the Dead City, and also a couple of test levels. Another feature of this build is the introduction of an incredibly basic inventory system that might not even work sometimes. It also has some of the very first anomalies, although they are also incredibly unfinished. Right, so here we are in the cordon. You have already seen this cordon many times, and you're probably wondering, S.T.A.L.K.E.R, what the fuck, like, why are you showing me the cordon again for like the 6th time in this series? I don't want to see the cordon, I want to see the Chernobyl power plant. Like, where's the Chernobyl power plant? You give me CNPP. Just, okay, be patient, alright? Be patient for a couple of seconds. The reason that I decided to load up cordon here is because I want to show you something before I go to the Chernobyl power plant. So, let me just pick some of the weapons here off the ground. And what I want to show you is the inventory system that they added for this build. It works just like in the release game. If you press I, it opens up. And as you can see there, it's incredibly basic. It's just a couple of lines, text, and that's it. There's not even a UI, it's literally just text. And you control it by pressing the number keys. So if I press 2, I unequip the pistol, and if I press 3, I unequip the rifle. And if I press down there, as you can see in the bag, by pressing certain keys, I can equip them again. So if I press B, I put the pistol back up, and if I press B again, I put the rifle. The other thing you have to do is the ammunition. This early in development, they had an idea for the ammo to have to be equipped before you could use it. So instead of just having it in your inventory, you had to equip it to the belt to be able to use it. So as you can see, we have some ammo down there, 9x18 and 5.56. If I press B, I equip 9x18, and if I press B again, I equip 5.56. You cannot move while the inventory is open, obviously because you have to use the movement keys and the numbers to actually select what you want to use. To exit the inventory, you just press 0, and now you're back. And with the ammo on the belt, the guns now work. So obviously it's a very basic inventory system, not really, definitely not finished. I mean, it doesn't even have a UI, it's just numbers and letters. But still, an early version what would later become the inventory we use in the release game. But that's about it. I just wanted to show you the inventory really quick so that later on when I use it, you already understand what's going on instead of being confused. But this is the basic inventory system. This is how it works, and if you play this build, now you know how it works. See you in the CNPP. And here we are in Chernobyl nuclear power plant, and as you can see, it's a pretty big fucking map. Like, look at it. It is the north and the south fused into one single map. Like, it is huge. And I must say, like, the modeling that they did here, like for a 2003 game engine, is phenomenal. Like, the lengths that they went to try and model the CNPP accurately and recreate it in a 3D environment on such an early game engine is very impressive. Truly a giant technical achievement for GSC. And you can see it's a little bit different from the one released. First, the Operation Monolith hasn't, happened yet in this build, so the whole place looks a little more, pristine, because there's downed helicopters and fires all over the place. Not only that, but overall, this version of the CNPP is just more, I don't know how to say it, preserved compared to the one on release, because many of the buildings here, and especially these walkways between the buildings, in the release game they're destroyed, but in this build they're still intact. Not only that, but the fortifications that the Monolith built in the release game haven't been added yet, so the rooftops of these buildings are actually completely clean and don't have any of the cover and fortifications of the Monolith. Obviously this is because this is a very early CNPP, so they didn't add any of the objects or anything. They were just trying to recreate the place in 3 dimensions. And the reason I'm giving you a flyby instead of, walking around the map is because it is literally too big. Like, it is so huge that if I were to actually go, walking around from beginning to end, it would take so long. It would just be boring. So I'm just gonna give you a giant flyby instead. One of the differences that I spotted between this one and the release is that the generators aren't present yet. Like, they're gone. Like, those giant generators shooting electricity into the sky that appear in the release, they aren't here. There's also many other differences. Like, I think the helicopters that are parked near the CNPP are also missing in this version. Overall, I don't really know how this version would have played if it was, preserved until release, because you can understand, the CNPP works in the final game because it is separated into multiple sectors, north and south. So how would this one play? Like, would you still have to fight through the military, through the south, and then reach the north? would the sarcophagus still be accessed from only the south area, or would there be or would the entrance, be in the north? Overall, it's impossible to tell how this would have played, and to be honest, I actually personally believe it was a good thing that they separated it into 2 levels, because even for 2003, running this level was probably hard as fuck. So I'm thankful that they eventually, noticed that this was a little too big and then cut it back down. Now that we got a good look at this NPP, let's go to the Dead City. Alright, so we're loading in here into the Dead City, the original Dead City. And before I show you the city, I want to show you something first. So if I press F3 here, I can show you the new player model that they have for this build, which instead of the old Stalker is actually an early version of the monolith suit. In fact, this might be the very first monolith suit ever made. I mean, it already looks very similar to the one on release. The only thing really missing is that, cool digital camo they have. So this is the first monolithian we ever got to see in Stalker. Now, this Dead City here might be a little bit different from the one you're probably familiar with. See, the Dead City that's usually used in these mods, like for example Anomaly, isn't this one. That Dead City, the one they use for mods, is actually a much later version, most likely the one used in Build 1935. This one is a very early Dead City, which makes it very different from the ones that shows up in the mods. So you will recognize some parts of it, but most of it is different, especially the terrain. It has a lot more hills and houses. It's very different from the ones that shows up in mods. The only thing that stayed the same is the city itself, but the area around it changed heavily throughout development. What's interesting is the lore of this place. Like, in the documents, it's kind of confusing. Dead City is sometimes named as the place where the Freedom faction is based, but at the same time, later documents say that the mercenaries would have been based here, and that the player would have been kidnapped by the mercenaries and would be brought here. And here, the player would meet the doctor, who also got kidnapped by the mercs, and it would be revealed that the player was S.T.A.L.K.E.R. And later on, it will be some kind of military raid that would allow the player and doctor to escape. But still, seeing this contradicting thing where it's like, oh, the mercenaries were supposed to be here, but at the same time Freedom was supposed to be here, it's a little confusing. Build 1472-2. Now, you might be a little confused, like what I mean by 1472-2 and why is there 2 builds 1472? Let me explain. This build 1472-2 is called that because it was compiled on the very same day as the original build 1472. So because of this, they have the exact same build number. In fact, this build was compiled only 10 hours and 6 minutes after the original 1472. But although they were compiled on the same day and even share the same number, they are not the same build. This build only features one level, which is called LM02_Poor People. Weird name for a test level for sure, but whatever. Sadly, this build has the same problem as build 1469. I cannot run it. The only way to play it is if you have a specific graphics card, which is the NVIDIA GeForce FX 5900 Ultra Graphics. So because I don't have that graphics card, I can't run it. It just refuses to open. Sadly, another one that can only run on specific hardware. Build 1475. This build was created by GSC to show off the current progress of the project to THQ, the publisher. Generally speaking, it is very similar to Build 1472, but it is much less stable and with a new set of levels. These levels being the first version of the raw stock factory, which is much larger than the one on release, alongside the first appearance of the generators and an early version of X18. The main purpose of this build was to test the very first developments on A-Life, in particular the mechanism responsible for the transition of game creatures from online to offline mode and vice versa. However, since this version of A-Life is very early, it is incredibly unstable and prone to crashing. Alright, so the first map we're going to be looking at here is the early Dark Valley Lab, also known as X18. Now, you might notice a couple of differences here in the entrance, but to be fair, this whole first area here kind of stayed the same. It's just the entrance with the little checkpoint over here. The elevator, the only difference is there's none of those lockers here yet. But the lab down below changed a lot. So this entrance right here kind of stayed the same, but the lab we're about to go into changed heavily. Sadly, there's no flashlight in these builds, so you know we can't. If it gets dark, it just gets dark. Now that fucking horrible sound that you just heard there, that's the early detector beeping like shit. It is the worst detector sound I have ever heard, and it's terrible. Like I'm still surprised that they actually used this for a while. Like it's so annoying. It's basically ear rape. So we can already see one of the first differences here. So the first level, it has a giant anomaly and this little side computer room sort of place. And you probably already noticed the little jumping things on the floor. Those are the second artifacts to ever be created. So the first artifact ever made was the Mercury Ball artifact, but the second one is this one that you see flying around, which is the magnet. The best comparison I can make is that this magnet artifact kind of looks like a giant boat with some weird texturing placed on it. It also seems to display some kind of like anti-gravitational properties because of how it's bouncing around. Kind of reminds me of the gravitational artifacts, kind of like jellyfish. It bounces all over the place, so maybe this is an early version of a gravitational artifact. Now, I'm not gonna talk too much in this section here. Instead, I'm just gonna give you like a bit of a walkthrough throughout this entire early level, and I'm just gonna let you soak in on the, to be quite honest, very creepy atmosphere of this entire build and level. now that we finished with the first floor, I'm gonna go down to the second floor now, which is also much larger compared to the one we got on release. Again, we got a bunch of magnets flying around, and now I'm just gonna give you a silent walkthrough of this level. So this is the control room. It's an early version of the control room we saw on release, and the most interesting part about this area is there's a big difference between this one and the release one, almost like baby poltergeists in tanks. Well, there's an additional one in this build, a two-headed one, which I'm pretty sure doesn't show up in the games. So that's odd. There's also another one here that seems to be growing a tail. So this actually has unique, like, baby poltergeist models, you know what I mean? Quite interesting. The control room itself is much more barren though. If you go through here, we'll loop back around to the staircase. And now we can continue to level 3. And this is where in the release game you would have fought the pseudo giant, but instead of being accessed in level 2, you access it in level 3. And in here we can find Sid. You probably were not expecting to see him here, but the reason that Sidorovich is in all of these maps is because for some reason, if he's not in the map crashes. Again, no one knows why, but for some reason if they remove Sid during these builds, the entire build just refuses to work. It's kind of like the TF2 coconut in a sense. If they remove this one NPC, the whole thing just refuses to launch. So in every single level of all of these, in every single level of build 1475, there's a Sidorovich hidden somewhere on the map. Now of course he wasn't called Sidorovich back then. This character right here was referred to as Dealer at the time, but this is what would later become Sid. And yes, if you kill him, the whole thing crashes, so I'm not gonna do that. So that's it for X18. Up next we'll see the early Rostock. Hi guys, S.T.A.L.K.E.R here. So instead of transitioning to the Rostock map and then later on to the generators, while I was recording this, I discovered that the maps of this build, especially Rostock and generators, plus the next build that I was going to cover, 1511, are a little too big for one episode. Like, this video would just be too bloated if I were to include them all in this same episode. So for the sake of keeping this a little bit shorter and a little bit better, I'm gonna split this episode in two parts. So this is part 1, from 1469 to the first level of 1475. Part 2 will be the rest of 1475 plus 1511. Again, the reason I'm doing this is because if I were to do both of those in the same video, it would just be too long, it would be too bloated. And Buildo videos are supposed to be a little bit shorter compared to, you know, the iceberg, for example. So I will have to cut this one in two parts. So this is part 1, and I'll see you at part 2.